Hello, everyone. Good to be with the church this morning down in Guyana. I hope you are having a beautiful day. We are having one here. It's unusual for February in Alabama to be warm, but I think our temperatures are close to 80 degrees today. So it's a very, very enjoyable day. And I hope you're having a day similar to that down in Guyana. Always good to be with you. I look forward to studying with you. We're still looking at the second chapter of the book of 2 Thessalonians. I need to hear from you. This is a special announcement. Need to hear from you about what you want to continue studying once we have finished the study of 2 Thessalonians. There's only 3 chapters in this book, and we're in chapter 2. Even though this is going to be a little slow in the presentation because of the seriousness of this particular study and the fact that it's difficult. I'm not the sharpest pencil in the box, so I'm not saying I have all the answers to this particular passage. But I think we can learn enough about what Paul wants us to know about this in order to understand the truth of it. And that's what we're going to be trying to do this morning. If you have your Bibles, let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And I want to read the first 4 verses, and then we'll go back and discuss some of these. Beginning in verse number 1. Now I read from the New International Bible, and if you have something different, I know that it'll be close, but the reading may be a little bit different. Looking at the first 4 verses, it says, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, saying that the day of the Lord has already come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Now, we looked briefly at some of this last Sunday, and we want to continue looking at it. We did mention that, a lot of Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians as well as 2 Thessalonians, deals with the second coming of Christ. Now, this is an important subject. In fact, Paul says in these letters that we need to encourage one another with the second coming, and that is important. I don't know if I mentioned to you last week or not, but my bulletin article that I write for the church this week is on this particular subject. Where do you want to be when the Lord comes again? And this ought to encourage us. I know it was an encouragement to me to think about this, that if the Lord were to come today, where would I want to be? Where would I want God to see me? Where would I want him to find me? That's extremely important. And by looking at these things, it can be an encouragement. Now, as we look at this particular passage, Paul begins by saying, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him. This has to do with the Lord's return and you and me being united with him when this transpires. And so he says this is important, and we want to know as much about this particular passage as we possibly can. Now, Jesus taught about his second coming, and he made mention that when the Son of God comes, he'll gather all the nations to him. We know that's going to happen. when Jesus returns to this earth, not to reign for 1,000 years, but when he returns to, judge mankind, it says all the nations are going to be gathered unto him. Back over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 17, Paul says, talking about the second coming, he said, when the Lord comes, he'll bring with him those that have already preceded us in death. So when Jesus comes again, he's going to bring back with him those that precede us in death. Now, if we die before the second coming, we'll be among those that will be coming back when, Jesus comes. If I'm here when he comes again, there's a lot of people he's going to bring with him that I'm going to be excited to see. I'm going to be excited to see my father and my mother and my grandmother and others that have been faithful, people that I have taught that have passed on. I'm going to be excited about seeing those folks. Now, he's going to bring them. And if we die before he comes, we get to be in that group that's going to come back with him. Now, that's, extremely important. And so Paul admonishes, don't become unsettled or alarmed about things that people are saying. He said, don't become uneasy or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter to have come from us. He said, don't let these things, cause you to be disturbed. Now, these apparently were all false reports. And Paul, is going to expose those things. We need to learn what is here and be confident about the things that we learn. Paul, when he wrote the Ephesian letter, said, I don't want you tossed to and fro with every wind of doctrine. So he doesn't want us to be drawn away by teaching that is not, inspired by him. So it's up to us to look at what is written and, prove those things. Now, he talks about some prophecy. I think this, has to deal with false prophets. They're the ones that, teach or prophesize, and I think prophecy has to do with teaching. Now, if you'll turn to back to 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 19, he says, don't put out the Spirit's fire. Verse 21 or verse 20, he says, do not treat prophecies with contempt. Test everything. Hold on to the good. Avoid every kind of evil. So the responsibility of what is being taught is our responsibility to know what the truth of these matters are. So when it comes to, a prophecy, like these folks, he's telling them, you need to be the ones to prove these things so that you will not be unsettled or alarmed over these particular things. He said, one, prophecy or a false report. This is somebody teaching falsely the message of God. And this has gone on for a long time. If you go back to Acts chapter 15 and you look at the Jerusalem council, when Paul and Silas were there, it said, some people had come down from Judea and was teaching that Paul and Silas were saying, you don't need to baptize or you don't need to circumcise your children. Well, they didn't understand the teaching. What Paul and Silas were saying is we were no longer under that law. But, this was a false teaching that people were saying and putting the wrong emphasis upon what Paul was saying. So we have to be careful. There's false prophecy, there's false teachers, and he also says, some letter that has come from us. And we have to be careful, about what we read. There were false writings during that time. Now, Paul's going to say in chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, he says, "Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times and in every way. The Lord be with all of you. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand." Now, why would Paul say that? Why would he say, I've written this greeting with my own hand? I think that is to authoritize what is contained in this letter. He's saying this isn't just something somebody, has made up. Paul had defended his apostleship, his inspiration from God, and he says, now I've penned this with my own hand. Now that ought to be authority enough for people to believe what it is that Paul had to write. And what he was saying is, don't you be uneasy about these things. People that have taught that, Jesus Christ has already come and you missed it. He did not want there to be misunderstanding. In verse number 2, he said that day of the Lord has already come. That's what was confusing the people. Where these came from, we don't know. False teachers, yes, we know. But, what the origin of these things were, we, really don't know. But what it was doing was causing a great deal of confusion, about this particular item. And it was extremely important that they know the truth about the second coming of Christ. Now, what Paul is going to say, he gives some identifying marks that's going to help them understand when this day is going to take place. And if you go back and look at what he says there in chapter 2, he said, talking about the day that he comes, he said, it will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed. Now there's two signs that he gives that the second coming is not going to take place until they see this rebellion and until the man of lawlessness is going to be revealed. Now, these are the sticking points of this particular study, to know, what is taught, the truth about these two items. If you look at what he talks about as far as the rebellion, in the Greek language, and I'm not a Greek scholar by any means, and I don't, pretend to be, and I use very few Greek terms. Now, I'll go look at them to try and help me get a better understanding, but I'm not a Greek scholar. When I was preaching in Oklahoma, one of the members of that congregation was a man by the name of Raymond Kelsey. Raymond Kelsey taught at Oklahoma Christian University, and what he taught was Greek. Well, he read from a Greek New Testament. I wasn't about to use a Greek term with a Greek scholar who reads from a Greek New Testament. He didn't carry an English New Testament. He carried a Greek New Testament. And he understood very well, the meaning of a lot of Greek terms. Now, I might have referred to some, but I just didn't dwell upon those. One of our elders here at Prattville also reads from a Greek New Testament, but he was taught by that professor out in Oklahoma at Oklahoma Christian University, and he understands, a lot of Greek. I don't bring up a lot of those subjects with him because of the fact that he understands this. Now, the word in the Greek language, though, for this rebellion is the word apostasia, and we get our English word apostasy. And apostasy has to do with a falling away. And what Paul is saying here, Christ is not going to come back until this falling away has taken place. And his inference is that this has not occurred, or it hasn't occurred to the extent of what is being talked about here. And the second thing he's going to talk about is this man of lawlessness. And we will not get to that today, but we will explore that next week. Now, let's look at ways that this word apostasia was used. Now, it was used in the Old Testament. Now, I know people say, well, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and that's correct, it was. But there is a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint used this word apostasia in talking about, the rebellion. And some passages like Joshua 22:22, where it says, this has been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord. So, Joshua was talking about the children of Israel, and already before they went into the promised land, things that they were doing. He said, that's an apostasy. That's a rebellion. And it's falling away from what, the truth is. And again, in Jeremiah chapter 29 and in verse 32, it talks about Shemaiah, who preached rebellion against God. Again, that's this word apostasia, and it's translated rebellion. Now, there's another word that is also translated from this word apostasia, and that's the word unfaithfulness. So you have rebellion and you have unfaithfulness. In 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 19, it says, we have prepared and concentrated all the articles that King Ahaz removed in his unfaithfulness while he was king. And that word unfaithfulness is this same word, apostasia. So it was a rebellion. It was a falling away. It was not keeping, with the will of God. Talking about King Manasseh, it says all his sins and unfaithfulness. So unfaithfulness is part of what is being discussed by Paul here in chapter 2. Another word that is translated from apostasia is the word backsliding. Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 19. It says, your backsliding will rebuke you. And so here these Old Testament terms are being translated rebellion, unfaithfulness, backsliding. So this is what really is going to take place before the second coming of Christ. Now, how's it used in the New Testament? That's important to us. And this word appears several times in the New Testament, apostasia. In Acts chapter 21 and verse 21, it says to turn away from Moses. And this was talking about, the fact that, people were not keeping the Old Testament law. And they called it a turning away from Moses. That turning away is that same word, apostasia. And that's what's going to take place. People are going to turn away from God. Now, a similar word is used in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 1. It says, some will abandon the faith. That's the rebellion. People are going to abandon what they have been taught. And again, in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12, it's a warning against, unbelieving hearts. And he says, a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. This turning away is the apostasy. And this is very prevalent in, our world today, people turning away from the teachings of God. So the use of apostasia in the Bible in context points to a religious apostasy. So what Paul is talking about is there's going to be some religious apostasy that is going to take place before the second coming of Christ. Now, where is this going to be prevalent? Well, I think, the Bible is very clear. It's going to be in several different areas. One of them is in leadership. Paul called the elders of the church at Ephesus to him at the city of Miletus. And here's what he had to say. This is Acts chapter 20, beginning verse 29. He said, I know that after I leave, savage wolves will come in among you and will not spare the flock. Even from your own number, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them. This was the elders that he was talking to. And he said, from among your own number. So there's going to be elders that are supposed to watch over the flock. And this has to do with, teaching truth and making sure that truth is taught. And he says, this is going to take place. After I depart, this is going to happen from among your own number. And he's talking about an apostasy that's going to take place. And he also said it's going to take place, just with false teachers themselves. And this has to do with the prophecies that Paul talks about here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And he talks about false prophets. And Peter talks about this in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, when he said, but there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. So it's true that people, are going to be false. Everybody is not going to be preaching and teaching truth. Men, deny in practice what they say with their mouths, or what they say, in principle. Jesus referred to this in Luke chapter 6 and verse 46. He says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? So here they were not practicing what Paul wanted, or what Jesus said he wanted them to do. He said, I've said this, but you're not doing it. So there's going to be that, falling away. And also there's going to be deceiving spirits and demons. Now, I don't know how this works, but 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 to 3 says the Spirit clearly says that in latter times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Now, he's talking about this time in which we're living right now. These are the latter days. This apostasy is coming. The responsibility to make sure that, we're believing truth lies with you and lies with me. And this apostasy is already underway today. And lawlessness is already at work. Paul said that in verse number 7. Skip down there real quick. He said, for the secret power of lawlessness may be revealed at the proper time. This is already, taking place. And it's at work already with us today. So we have to be careful. The responsibility lies with us to make sure that, what we are hearing is true and what we're teaching is true. It puts a lot of responsibility upon us as teachers to make sure we're teaching truth. But it also puts a lot of responsibility upon us as hearers to make sure we hear it the way God intended it to be. We're told that, there will be terrible times in these last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, and proud. That's in the time in which we live. I think we all know that certainly is, already happening, that this is taking place. It doesn't, the context does not reveal that, this is going to be sometime in the future from which we're living today. This is the last days. And we're in those last days. And this apostasy is already at work. People are being drawn away by false teaching, false prophecies, reports. Paul made sure that they understood that these reports they were hearing did not come from him. He said, this one is written with my own hand. Now, all I can say to us today, you and me, is that we make sure that, what we're hearing is not drawing us away from the truth. And we need to make sure that what we're teaching is not drawing people away. James said many of us shouldn't be teachers because we're going to receive the greater condemnation. I'm going to give an account for every word that I speak. So I need to be careful of what I say, and I need to make sure that it's truth. So, this is the admonition here. Now, some of the more difficult passages to understand are those that are going to follow. That is, dealing with the man of lawlessness. And next week when we get together, we'll try to explain this as best we can. Now, I hope you're thinking about what we're going to study together next time, and you'll get in touch with me and let me know what it is that you want to study. It's been good to be with you today. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have a blessed day. I hope you have a great Sunday, and I hope you spend that in praise to God. I look forward to you being with you again next week. Until then, may God bless you and keep you.